to join us today. This is you're joining our Ensuring Cost-Efficient and Secure Remote Working with Windows Virtual Desktop. This is one of several webinars we produced, such as protecting and governing your Microsoft Office 365 platform, how to control costs for continuous optimization on Azure, and if you're struggling for who's got access to what in your organizations around Microsoft Teams. So for further details, please look at our website, www.bluesource.co.uk. So to begin with, virtual desktops, thin client computing has been around for years. However, more recently, working with our clients who needed robust, secure and performant remote working and contractor solutions, Microsoft's Windows Virtual Desktop has become a major disruptor in the desktop virtualization space and an important component to consider when you're looking at your digital workplace transformation journey. When working with our clients, we consider factors around costs versus performance versus security, especially when considering working virtual desktop. In the old days, you would have either performance and security, but costs became the issue, or you gave up some of your performance in order to meet security or cost goals. We'll show you why with Windows Virtual Desktop, you do not need to make those compromises. We will also demonstrate migrating Citrix ShareFile to OneDrive or SharePoint. Again, focusing on reducing costs, improved performance and end user experience, as well as increased security and compliance. So there's a number of clients in the legal and housing world joining us today. So welcome guys, but there's a few clients as well that we haven't spoken to as well. So welcome today as well. So to take you on this journey, I've got VM Mercer, 17 years in the IT industry, the last 8 with BlueSource. He currently heads up our BlueSource Azure practice and specializes in helping organizations realize secure and compliant Microsoft Cloud services for both Azure and Microsoft 365 technologies. VM works closely with organizations as a trusted advisor to help shape their IT services landscape and help them assess and understand where cloud technologies fit and benefit their business. I also have Rakesh Chancheri. He's the CTO of Proven Tech, a leading provider of migration and productivity solutions for Microsoft 365. Rakesh has spent over 2 decades working with various enterprise content management, archiving solutions, SharePoint, Office 365 and Azure, and has worked closely with organizations around the world, helping them with their digital transformation and content consolidation projects to the cloud. Several of these customers moved successfully from Citrix, SharePoint and Microsoft 365, and I know Rakesh is going to spend some time there. And myself, John Ford, Sales Director here at BlueSource, too many years around the place, and some of you will attest to that as well. So we will take some questions as well, and please stay till the end so we can give you what the next actions are as well. Without further ado, I'd like to pass over to VM Mercer. VM and Rakesh, welcome guys, and VM, over to you.
Thanks, John. So just looking at what we're going to cover very briefly, we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges, so I'll do that next. Going to talk a little bit about secure and productive remote working. We'll look at some of the ways you can optimize costs with WVD. Then I'm going to hand over to Rakesh, who's going to talk about the legacy enterprise file sharing services migrations. And then I'll talk a little bit again around how we optimize the user experience, and then how do you get started on this journey. So in this section, I just want to talk a little bit about our experiences with Windows Virtual Desktop and kind of how we're helping a lot of our clients in this space. So as we go through the next few sections, I'd just like you to ponder 3 questions. Think about how you're approaching these things. So how are you ensuring that your virtual desktop infrastructure is nice and secure, there's no data leakage holes, but still make sure that you're delivering a decent, seamless user experience? How confident are you that you're making the most out of your investment in Microsoft 365? So this question comes up a lot for us. And then finally, how do you ensure that your virtual desktop costs don't spiral, but still make sure you're delivering a really great user experience? So let's have a look at the current challenge. So virtual desktop infrastructure services are really beneficial to many businesses. And it could be for remote working, it could be in-house working, just standardizing that desktop estate for the organization. And there's, as John mentioned earlier, it's been around for a long time. There's plenty of VDI vendors out there, some of which, only a handful of which I'm showing here. Some of those are better known than others. So you've got your Citrixes, your VMwares, and your Microsoft, so the old remote desktop type environments, and some are less well known. I mean, even Cisco have a solution for virtual desktop. But my point here is really that they all have some common challenges that we need to overcome. Sometimes they can be a little complex. So there's maybe lots of components, lots of infrastructure components to administer. They can sometimes be a little complicated to license. So many of these platforms will include lots and lots of features and functionality, and lots of technology and features that actually a lot of organizations are already licensed for. So if you've got subscriptions such as Microsoft 365, then you may well already be licensed for a lot of the features that you're now paying for again through some of the more traditional VDI vendors. And so all of this can lead to administrators spending lots of time maintaining infrastructure. And of course, then that means they've got less time to concentrate on supporting the business. And of course, as I mentioned, you may also be paying twice for similar feature sets. So if we take something like Citrix as an example, they've got a whole suite of services, virtual apps and desktop, ShareFile services, the NetScaler app delivery controllers, and there's more, so on and so forth. So I just want to be clear, I'm not saying that Citrix is no good. Absolutely, it's got a great name for itself in the industry. So I'm not telling you that there's something wrong with Citrix. It's great. But the reason for this webinar, and really my point, is that with Windows Virtual Desktop, Microsoft has really simplified the end-to-end deployment approach and also the ongoing management approach. And so it can deliver for many organizations just as much, if not more scale, at a potentially reduced price point. So it really does depend on what you're already licensed for. But we're tending to find the more and more conversations we have that many organizations will be able to get all the features that they want, optimize their cost model, and deliver a nice, secure and compliant and familiar desktop experience for the users. And of course, that means you don't have to manage all of that traditional on-prem infrastructure or even private cloud infrastructure. So we also see issues with things like performance, and that comes up quite a lot with virtual desktop. Many of the deployments we look at sometimes end up struggling when they're reaching that high concurrency. So when you're architecting a traditional on-prem virtual desktop infrastructure, you've got to think about what's the balance, cost versus performance. So we don't really architect for the highest sporadic peaks, because then we just end up spending way too much on the solution, and that ROI really does suffer. So we tend to architect for the middle ground or the averages, and with that, sometimes at those peak times, the performance can suffer a little bit. So we're going to talk about a little bit later on how with Windows Virtual Desktop we can address those concerns with things like auto scaling. Another common challenge we see is around logon times. So again, this is due to user profile performance. Most VDI solutions support something called roaming profiles, and this profiling technology has been around for years, and it's been causing administrators pain for years as well, just because the way roaming profiles work and is dependent on the network. So we'll talk a little bit about how Windows Virtual Desktop changes the game there with a product called EFSS Logics. So with that, I want to explore a little bit about how we can start to address those challenges with our Microsoft Windows Virtual Desktop solution. And the first thing that I really want to cover is around secure productivity. So we're talking about security, but actually it's about making sure that you've got a nice, secure platform whilst not impacting user productivity and business productivity. And really one of the main objectives of the Microsoft 365 platform, and to a certain extent the Azure cloud services, is to empower users to be productive, no matter where they are, no matter how they want to work or when they want to work, and whichever endpoint they choose to use. that message is really consistent across the Microsoft Cloud services, and it's no different with Windows Virtual Desktop. We can also leverage Microsoft's zero trust approach to security operations. So I'm aware zero trust is a bit of a buzzword at the moment, but it really is about ensuring that you trust nothing, assume breach, and use all of the controls that you can to protect that environment. So all of those controls that we get through Azure Active Directory and the Defender product suite are available to us in Windows Virtual Desktop as well. So I'm talking about things such as conditional access, as you see here. So it's got fully integrated multi-factor authentication. It doesn't matter where your users are, where they access that Windows Virtual Desktop estate, you can control how they're going to access that environment and spot the signals. So spot the geolocation. Is it a corporate or a personal device? What's the risk of that particular user as they're logging in? And a whole bunch of other signals. And then we take those signals and we can make certain decisions around whether they're allowed access, whether they're we're going to block access at this point, or maybe prompt for a multi-factor authentication and then allow access into the environment. And then finally, we can manage this and enforce this through all the same conditional access platforms that you're already using, likely to protect the rest of the cloud estate. So all of your Azure Active Directory estate. And then we come on to malware or anti-malware. So running anti-malware and threat protection tools generally on VDI has always been a little bit problematic. They typically need to be installed in a very specific way, and we've got to make sure certain processes are blocked or exempt from scanning in our master images or our gold images. Otherwise, when we generalize those master images, typically they'll break. So I'm sure a lot of you have been through that pain. So with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, Microsoft has made it very nice and easy for us. We don't really have to do much customization at all. It's already baked into the platform, and as we're running a true Windows 10 multi-session environment, Defender is really part of the operating system, and it's nice and familiar for our end users. But we can also take that one step further and onboard the Windows 10 session hosts to advanced threat protection, the Defender advanced threat protection. And so we can then take advantage of some of the more advanced capabilities. We've got the threat and vulnerability management, which I'm sure all of you know about, but we've also got things like attack surface reduction. So we can define policies to minimize those vulnerabilities and minimize the attacks that could take place on our environment by analyzing what looks good. So what is usual behavior? And then if we see any anomalies, we can target those. We can also use things like app control, which allows us to define which processes can and cannot run, as well as the usual exploit, network and web protection, and of course things like controlled folder access. So that allows us to define protected folders and then flag whenever an app or a process attempts to change data in that folder. Then of course we've got the usual endpoint detect and respond. So this allows us to perform our threat hunting, not only across the Windows Virtual Desktop estate, but also as an extension to Microsoft 365. So when this is all integrated together, we can perform integrated threat hunting across the entire cloud estate. And then, not to forget, automated remediation. So with some of this, with the automation capabilities of Defender for Endpoint, we can run some automatic investigations, but not only that, automatic remediation where possible of some of those threats. And as I said earlier, this also correlates across the entire Microsoft 365 suite. So what that means is if we find and identify a threat on a Windows Virtual Desktop session host, we can not only protect that host, but we can protect all the other hosts that are in the pool, every Windows 10 desktop that's in our environment, and Office 365, all of the storage, the cloud storage in Office 365 as well. And then not to forget, we also have access to the usual session host controls. So we can block clipboard, or we can allow clipboard. We can control the device redirection. So stop access to printers or allow access to printers, and all of that good stuff that comes with Virtual Desktop as well. So when we put all of these controls together, we're really ensuring that we can operate a nice secure platform, but also we're minimizing the impact to user productivity. And so this leads us on to what I think is quite an important topic. So this is all about how Windows Virtual Desktop can help us deliver a nice cost-efficient VDI service. I'm thinking that VDI or cost and optimizing costs is quite important to most people today. So with any virtual desktop solution, there's several key areas to consider when you're thinking about operational costs, and also several key areas where Microsoft can deliver value with Windows Virtual Desktop. So the first thing is all about infrastructure. And when we're thinking about infrastructure, we're thinking about several things. Firstly, compute. So at the compute layer, there are a whole myriad of options that we can choose from, really depending on what the business requirements are. But if we specifically think about cost optimization, then really we've got to figure out who's using the platform, where they're going to use that platform from, when they want to use the platform. And with those decisions made, or those things identified, we can then make the right decisions as to how we're going to build that session host and compute layer. So we can look at things such as auto scaling. So this is all about spinning up hosts as and when we need them, as the demand increases on the platform, and then we'll spin them back down out of hours to save cost. We could look at reserved instances. So this is about committing to upfront to a 1 or 3 year commercial impact for compute costs, so we can leave these running 24/7. So if our business fits that model, this can deliver a really significant cost saving. We could look at things like boot schedules, so scheduled startups, scheduled shutdowns. So we'll use things like automation runbooks to schedule the booting up and powering down of those session hosts. If we know that our business hours are 8 till 8 and we don't need anything outside of those hours, then we only need to have those servers up during that period. If we shut it down outside of those periods, we're going to save cost because we're getting billed by the hour on the compute side of things. And then, of course, VM sizing. So with Microsoft Azure, we can have flexible virtual machine sizing. So we can make sure that we're picking the right combination of CPU and memory based on the exact application landscape, and of course, the number of users that we expect to use the platform. So we could, for instance, have lots of small machines, or we could have a few very large machines, really depending on what those apps are that we're going to run. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples around this. We were working on a deployment recently. As a UK-based asset manager, relatively few users, around 100 or so. They had a very specific requirement. They wanted to publish a single line of business app. It needed to be published out to the entire business. But what they really wanted is that they needed this to be accessible from anywhere, but securely. So they didn't want to deploy this app to the local PCs that people were taking home with them. They only operated in the UK, so they only needed session hosts to be available around 10 hours a day. So what we did, we took the requirements of the app, we sized the compute layer based on the app resource requirements, and then made the decision, well, what we're going to do is reserve one session host that's going to run 24/7, just in case anyone wanted to make use of it outside of those core business hours. And then everything else was going to be configured for auto scaling. So we were using a pay-as-you-go hosting model, but everything was shut down until needed. We then used a combination of the automation runbooks and some logic apps to do all the workflow piece. And that will then, as the demand increases on a particular session host, the system decides I need another session host, and it will boot another one up. So this for them delivered the most cost-efficient service. On the other side of the scale, another client we've been working with, well-known drinks company, they have a truly global footprint and needed a remote working solution for around 500 or 600 people. So again, we sized the VMs based on the apps deployed, and there were a lot of BI and ERP type tools, so pretty heavy resource requirements, and full access was needed 24/7 because it was a global system, and a lot of these people were external to the company. So in this instance, we decided not to go with auto scaling, but to go with active hosts only. And then to make this as cost efficient as possible, use reservations on the compute layer. So hopefully you get the idea. There's no one right way to do this, but this piece is really important decision that can influence the total cost of ownership of the entire service. So it is very important to put some thinking into this area. And then when we move on to the infrastructure, the storage infrastructure layer, there's less to think about here, but still a few things we want to talk about. So really, we want to choose managed disks for the session hosts so that their replication is automatically managed by Microsoft, and all of the availability and everything that comes with that. And then we typically recommend using Azure Files for the profile storage. And then you simply need to choose between standard and premium based Azure Files, really depending on what, how many users you're going to have and what your IOPS requirements are. So once you've done that on the storage layer, that's really it. So if you compare that to when you're managing storage on premises and managing SANs and volumes and all of that good stuff and the replication, this is by far much easier to manage, but still needs a little bit of consideration before you dive into it. Then we move on to the licensing layer, and this is an interesting one, or at least I think this is quite an interesting one. So I mentioned right at the start that many organizations have already invested in Microsoft 365. And if you have, well, guess what? You're already licensed for Windows Virtual Desktop. All you really need to add on to that is the cost for running the storage, the compute layer, and of course, don't forget the soft costs, the admin and the management costs. But essentially that's it. So what I'm saying is many of you may well be already licensed. And if you've got traditional VDI solutions, you're probably paying twice for this stuff already. So there's already a potential cost saving there. Again, I mentioned earlier that many organizations that have already invested in Microsoft 365 are always looking at ways of maximizing their ROI. Well, I think deploying Windows Virtual Desktop and replacing traditional VDI is a really great approach to maximize your investment in that Microsoft 365 SKUs. So just reach out to us and we'd be happy to kind of look at what those cost savings could be for you. So just to clarify, if you've got one of these SKUs, you are already covered for Windows Virtual Desktop at the licensing level. If you don't have one of these SKUs, then you can purchase one of these, or you could use the Windows 10 Enterprise per user licensing, and that again covers you for Windows Virtual Desktop. There's no other licensing costs to worry about, just that storage and compute that I mentioned earlier. And then one other area that we often see missed from the cost modeling are the soft costs. So I'm talking about things like the day-to-day admin costs, the management of the images and the updates, and the management of the session host infrastructure, and then of course end user support and system support. So I'm not going to go into these areas in a lot of detail today because I really wanted to just talk about the overall platform optimization. But what I'm really driving at in this section is that much of the Windows Virtual Desktop platform is managed by Microsoft. So the geo load balancing, the gateways, they're using Azure Front Door for this, the global high-speed backbone, all of the connectivity and the VDI gateways. All of that is managed by Microsoft. So you don't really need to worry about that. All you really need to worry about is how do I build the session hosts? How do I keep them up to date and make sure users have the right apps, and of course secure that platform. And of course keeping that system optimized and up to date is then where Bluesource can come in. So many of our clients hand that management back to us, and we will on their behalf manage the monthly patching, the update of the image and the rollout of the image, as well as all of the incident and problem management to make sure everything is running nice and smoothly. So at that point, I think I've been talking for long enough, so I'd like to hand over to Rakesh, and he's going to talk a little bit around migrating enterprise file sharing services.
Thank you, VM, for enlightening us on the advantages of moving VDI to the Azure environment. I would now like to touch upon the enterprise content, and Citrix offers a very popular product called the Citrix ShareFile. Now, ShareFile became popular because of the shortcomings of traditional FTP to share with external users, where it was very clunky or it was too techie-like. So Citrix came up with a very intuitive web-based interface and simplified sharing. So ShareFile is more of an EFSS or an enterprise file sync and share solution like Dropbox or Box compared to those ECM platforms like Documentum and FileNet. So ShareFile, generally, people would create personal folders to manage and sync the private files, or they would have shared folders to share content within the organization or with external parties, what they call as clients. Now, the key to success has been sharing in a very simplified way. Now, most organizations nowadays have some form of Microsoft 365 licenses. So it's inevitable that companies would look at replacing services such as ShareFile with an equivalent product from Microsoft. And some of the main drivers I would like to talk on. So in the next slide, we'll look at a few of the main drivers. So the topmost is cost. So how can you save money? Typical ShareFile licenses would cost around $25 a month, whereas you find equivalent a Microsoft 365 plan, which would be around $20 a month or so. And that provides a lot more than just file sharing. It provides you a lot of other services, everything from your email, your OneDrive, Stream, your Office app. So there's a lot of other products that are offered in that same price range. So it makes sense for a lot of customers to just consolidate everything onto a single product set. The second one is sharing. So as we saw earlier, ShareFile was very good at sharing. And what Microsoft has done in the last couple of years is they have simplified that sharing experience within OneDrive and SharePoint. It's a lot more user-friendly. So the sharing experience is much, much better within the M365 environment. The last is the security and compliance. These days, with everyone working remotely and the enterprise data being outside of your typical company network, the security and compliance features are extremely important. And Microsoft 365 has got a lot of compliance offerings, as well as information protection offerings that will allow documents to be secured even while it is outside your corporate network. So these are the three main drivers that that push customers from moving from platforms like Citrix ShareFile onto Microsoft 365. On the next slide, we will look at what are the main things you need to focus on if you decide to move from ShareFile to Microsoft 365. The first one is planning for external users. Because a lot of ShareFile content gets shared with external users, within Microsoft 365, you have ability to constrain all the content within the organization or to share externally. So you need to plan how that sharing will look like. Looking at solutions like an Azure B2B, or are you just opening up sharing within the organizations completely at the tenant level or at a particular level like SharePoint or OneDrive, who exactly can share with external users? So there are lots of settings that you can that is available for you, and you need to plan that before you move any of the content and share them. The next one is choosing the right Microsoft service. Because you have various services like OneDrive or SharePoint or Teams, it's knowing what is best to store the data. So if you have personal folders within ShareFile, so ShareFile, you would just have lots of different folders and then have that as personal or share it with external users. The personal ones are best stored in OneDrive, whereas the shared content, your organizational level shared content, can go into something like SharePoint or Teams, and you can then decide if that needs to be shared with external parties, then what level of external sharing is then set up on that team or on the site. The third one is deciding how to share. So that the sharing itself can be a simple sharing of the entire site, or you could share specific areas within that site, just some folders, libraries, or you could share individual documents. So you do have a lot of flexibility in how that sharing happens. And what we will see in a minute in the demo is how you can retain some of this information. The last one is enriching your content. ShareFile, because its focus has been just sharing, unlike your traditional ECM platforms, it doesn't really have this concept of creating classification, categorization, and a lot of metadata. So this can be an opportunity for you to look at your existing content, see how it can be enriched, how it can be recategorized, new metadata associated with it, so that you're searching, you're categorizing, all of this becomes much more effective, and you can filter the data, you can search for it much more easier than just having files in your system. So these are some of the main things you need to focus on while you move. So that we will now have a look at a short demo which shows you how exactly you can move from a system like Citrix ShareFile and move on to a Microsoft platform. So here you can connect to a Citrix system where you can have a lot of subfolders inside it, and connect to SharePoint, connect to a simple site collection or to the tenant, and then choose any areas from your ShareFile environment to be moved into the new environment. It provides you the ability to look into the content, to run a discovery and the analysis, to look at incompatible content, or just to understand what exactly is there on your source. Because not all content might be fully compatible, the checks are important to determine which content will move without any problems. You can have a proper insight into your existing landscape, how the content is used, by whom, when, how it is structured, what security is assigned to it, so you can plan for it in the new environment. All of the incompatibilities are visible, so you can have the right remediation in place before you move. Then you can look at the enrichment and the recategorization. Any of the existing content types within SharePoint can be used to recategorize content, and any of the standard metadata, like who created the document, who modified it, those key information can be moved. If there are any hyperlinks inside documents, they can be resolved, so they are fully functional in the new environment. And the restructuring, you can take folders and then move that into multiple site collections, into multiple teams, multiple libraries, and all the users and groups can also be moved onto an Office 365 users. Once you do all of the mapping, you can do a dry run, a simulation run to validate the outcome of all the rules that you specify, which will then tell you exactly what the where the content will end up, what content type will be assigned, what metadata would be assigned, how that enrichment is working. So that gives you enough insights into how the migration will progress. And then you can look at a real-time progress when the documents are being loaded, handle any errors, any remediation on these errors. And once the documents are in, the entire hierarchy gets recreated. You get a full fidelity migration with the security also being mapped across. So your sensitive content can still be secured in the new environment. And your restructuring will ensure that content has gone to different libraries or different site collections. You can even consolidate content from multiple locations into single. So you can plan for a better restructuring, and all the versions of the document will also be retained. So it is really a high fidelity migration with all of the metadata and the versions, security and the structure available. And at the end, you have full detailed reports that will tell you exactly where your item was in source and where it is in target now, giving the end user the confidence that none of the information is lost. And at the same time, all the relevant compliance policies can also be assigned to the content during the move. It also supports for larger migrations like incremental migration, where data can be added while the migration is happening, and you can pick up the difference and move that difference across. So it's very It's designed for large migrations. So as you saw, Citrix ShareFile is a great product, but there's a lot more features available within the Microsoft 365 environment, and the solution is there for you to move all of the content successfully. So I will hand this over back to John or VM.
Thanks, Rakesh. So thanks for talking about that. That was really insightful. Thank you. In this next section, what I'd like to do is just briefly discuss what the user experience would look like and how do we optimize those admin and user experiences to make a really good Windows Virtual Desktop platform. So this is going to cover several areas. We're going to talk about user profile management, image management, and a little bit about application management. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier on, user profiles are probably one of the most problematic areas when we're thinking about performance and traditional virtual desktop. Traditionally, we use something called roaming profiles, but these are generally prone to network delays. They're also prone to corruption because we're copying that profile across the network generally to and from the different session hosts and storage locations. And so Microsoft made a really great decision a while back, and they acquired some technology called EFSS. This really has changed the game with how we manage profiles. So with EFSS, we're able to attach virtual disks on demand. And so rather than loading what was a roaming profile over the network, being subject to all those potential delays, the whole profile can be stored on a virtual disk or maybe multiple virtual disks. And then when the user logs in, the disk is simply attached to the relevant session host and the profile loads. So that not only delivers a significantly quicker logon time, but it's much easier to manage and it is a lot less prone to corruption. So this is really a win-win. When we start thinking about things like image management, the concept is really very similar to traditional VDI. So we make sure we keep the image nice and lean, make sure it's completely hardened and 100% standardized. So really, we don't want any changes allowed directly to those active session hosts. All the changes must be controlled through our master image updates and then rolled out as necessary. So what does Windows Virtual Desktop give us? Well, it differs from most in that we can use something called Azure Shared Image Galleries. And what that enables us to do is define multiple image versions and then quickly test and roll back if we need to. So whereas before we would roll out a new image, get everybody to test it, and then we'd probably have to delete that and roll out a new image. With shared image galleries versioning, we can just say go and deploy the latest. If that doesn't work, we haven't deleted the old pool, so we just re-establish that, delete the latest one, and the previous one becomes the latest again. So it's nice and easy to manage those image versions and roll back if we encounter issues with patches or application updates and things like that. So again, this changes the game with how we're managing images and is a great asset to the Windows Virtual Desktop solution. And then finally, when we're considering app management, again, typically apps are installed onto the master image and then updates are controlled and rolled out as part of that image management. This is actually how we also do it in Windows Virtual Desktop today. And one of the challenges with this approach is that if we've got groups of users, let's say departments of users that all need different sets of applications, we need to typically define and manage many separate master images or golden images. And these images are then deployed to separate pools. And so we end up with something that looks a little bit like this. So I'll let that draw out. So you can see here we've got several different profiles. So these are our departments or our groups of users, and each one has their own image. Now we can still store those in an image gallery, and each one is then deployed to these separate pools. Now that's great, that works fine, but you've now got to manage 4 pools, 4 different images. Every time there's Patch Tuesday rolls around, we're going to push out patches to 4 different images, get our users to test them and manage that whole profile. So this really does add some overhead, but it's typically how it's done it. So as I said, we still do this with Windows Virtual Desktop today. And so I'm sure you're saying, well, you told me we're going to optimize things. How are you going to do that? Well, Microsoft have another technology called MSIX App Attach. It's just been pushed out into the portal now. And what that does is it changes the platform to decouple the apps from the operating system. So it kind of changes to this approach. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here due to time constraints, and this is a big subject. But to give you a bit of a high-level overview, what we do with the MSIX approach is we package the apps and we host them on individual virtual disks, a little bit like what I was talking about with the profiles. We assign those apps or those disks to groups of users, and those are then attached to the session hosts. So what this means is we can reduce down to 1 base image. Our base image will be our operating system, and it will have our application prereqs installed, and we can use generally that same master image across pretty much all our departments. We may still want to have different pools if we need to because of different resource requirements, but we can reduce the number of pools that we're managing and co-locate groups of users on the different pools, and then just simply attach those disks as we need them to the session hosts. So I've probably oversimplified that just for explanation purposes, and of course there's caveats to consider. Not every single application is going to be suitable for this approach. This is currently in public preview, but this will be another game changer to the way Windows Virtual Desktop works. And there are already tools to convert traditional apps into MSIX supported apps. So this again is going to help us optimize the experience, reduce the management overhead, and really deliver a very good and seamless user experience to our users. So hopefully you can see from just some of these things that we've been talking about that Microsoft is really investing a huge amount of time and effort into building a robust and optimized virtual desktop solution, and it really does fit into almost every organization. So what's next? How do we get started on this journey? So no doubt there's a few things that you're going to need to think about. You'll need to probably validate that WVD or Windows Virtual Desktop is a good fit for the organization. And you'll probably want to build out cost models to understand what the level of investment will be, so that you can build a nice business case and make the CFO happy and save lots of money and show all of these savings that we can make. So we can certainly help with running proof of concepts or production pilots, or even VDI assessments to understand and help you understand what's running in your existing VDI estate and how we can model those costs for moving to a Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure. So please do reach out to us, and we'd be more than happy to go into this in a bit more detail around your specific requirements. So just to summarize, we've talked about the challenges we face with VDI, how we can use Azure Windows Virtual Desktop to deliver a nice, secure and productive VDI platform, and then how we can optimize the costs on both the user experience and admin. And Rakesh has spoken about how we can migrate services such as ShareFile over to OneDrive for Business and SharePoint Online. So thanks for listening today, and I'm going to hand back over to John to wrap up.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Rakesh. And there was just a couple of questions we had. First one, I'll probably just do one from a time perspective. Can you move data from ShareFile to both OneDrive and SharePoint? So both to OneDrive, which are probably, Rakesh, that's probably to you.
Yes. Yeah, so the personal folders typically would go into OneDrive, so people can maintain that still as a personal file. whereas enterprise content or the shared folders within organization or with external parties typically gets moved into SharePoint environment. So yes, it can move into both workloads.
And just quickly on this one then, and can you move versions of documents from ShareFile? So not every, but just versions of documents?
Yes, so we do support moving all of the versions of the file, so you do not have to worry about losing any, the previous versions or the audit of the document. So yes, we will move all of the information, all the versions into SharePoint.
Cool. Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that. And listen, thank you everyone for joining. I know we've just done some next steps, and Vim, you kindly summarised. I suppose if I was to add my 2 pence onto it as well from listening to this, what we're going to do is reach out to you from an account management perspective and just see where you are on that journey. But if I was to give you some things to look at, make sure you understand your licensing M365. Let's make sure you're not paying twice. It's a really key obvious win. Microsoft Threat Protection, that Defender for Endpoint, Secure Score, Compliance Center, that now needs serious consideration. A few years ago, you would not be thinking about Defender. I think it now has a place, and again, when we reach out, that's probably one area we'll discuss with you further. Management, I think we made it very simple there, VM, but you've done a great job on that side. But that management of user profiles, master images, app management, I think is one of the bigger game changers as well for what you can be delivered there. And Rakesh, I know you covered it, that the potential ease of migrating. We can get you to where you need to be, taking advantage of what we discuss around costs, around performance and scalability as well. So thank you for listening. Have a great rest of the afternoon, and we'll be in touch from an account management perspective. And thank you very much for your time, and thank you, Rakesh, and thank you, VM. Have a great day. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, bye.